Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Tēnā koutou katoa. We are oversubscribed for seats, I'm afraid. So we need to make a start because we do have another lecture coming in after this. Sorry if you came a little bit early. We had problems with booking, and so the lecture was advertised originally at 12, but we needed to move it to 12:30. But it doesn't seem to have affected at least you people. My name is Chris Marshall. I hold the St John's Lectureship in Christian Theology at Victoria. On behalf of the University, on behalf of St John's and the City, I'd like to welcome you to this lecture, which is the third of a series of 4 public lectures this week under the title of Migrations of the Holy, Challenging the Myths of a Secular Age. Our speaker is Professor William T. Cavanaugh, who is the inaugural St John's Visiting Scholar in Religion this year at the university. And we're hoping that the St John's Visiting Scholar program will be an annual event. Bill is a senior research professor at the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology at DePaul University in Chicago and a very eminent public theologian. He holds a BA from Notre Dame, an MA from the University of Cambridge, and a PhD from Duke University, where he worked under the supervision of the well-known theologian Stanley Hauerwas, who was arguably one of the most important or influential theologians of his generation. We've greatly enjoyed Bill's lectures this week, which combine expert scholarship with a very deep social concern and, as you'll see shortly, a highly engaging style of communication. I've found Bill to be a very interesting man because he crosses lots of boundaries. He's a Catholic theologian who trained under a radical Protestant theologian, and he combines the best, I think, of both traditions. He's an accomplished and prolific scholar, the author of many important books and the editor of an academic journal, but he's also served as a lay associate with the Holy Cross Order in a poor neighborhood in Santiago in Chile in the 1980s and has worked following that to promote human rights of those existing under oppressive regimes. In fact, it was his work on documenting stories of torture in Pinochet's Chile that led him to do his doctoral work on torture and Eucharistic theology at Duke University. His first book, Torture and Eucharist, was published in 1998. It's been followed by several others, including The Theopolitical Imagination in 2002, The Blackwell Companion of Political Theology in 2004, Being Consumed in 2008, The Myth of Religious Violence in 2011, and just earlier this year, the Erdman's massive book, The Erdman's Reader in Contemporary Political Theology. And if all that is not impressive enough, he brews his own beer as well. Last night, for those of you who were there, Bill spoke on the myth of the free market, arguing that St. Augustine had a deeper and truer understanding of the nature of human freedom than does Milton Friedman, and that free market ideology actually masks deep forms of concentrated power and control that are anything but freedom creating. That message is perhaps less controversial today than it was in the 1980s and the 1990s because the global financial crisis has helped blow the cover and expose the truth. The theme of Bill's lecture today, at this noon, is the myth of prosperity, the economy of fantasy, and the global financial crisis. Please welcome him to the lecture.
Thanks again, Chris, for that kind introduction, and it's great to see so many people here again. I'm already recognizing some familiar faces, and I appreciate the hospitality that I've been shown since I've been here. If you're in Chicago, come by for a home brew anytime. So today I want to talk about the global financial crisis, which we've had a near meltdown in 2008, and since then the crisis has been contained but not quite. The jitters continue, have moved on from centers in the United States to Greece to Spain and so on. And I want to get to the heart of this. It's a fascinating phenomenon in one sense because even here halfway around the world, the winds that are blowing from Greece are felt here as well. And it's a new phenomenon. It's a globalized phenomenon. It's an abstract phenomenon. Philip Goodchild has a wonderful book called The Theology of Money, where he argues that money holds the same place in our society that God held in medieval society. It's a sort of mysterious, transcendent power that around which society is organized. And I think there's something very profound about that. So today I want to combine economics and theology again in this odd sort of way. This is kind of what I've made a career out of. My first book, as Chris mentioned, was Torture and Eucharist, so I had a priest friend who says those are the two principal parts of the Mass. First there's the sermon, which is torture, and then there's the Eucharist. But I have a habit of doing these things. So the first half is going to be talking about credit default swaps, and then in the second half we're going to be talking about Thomas Aquinas and the book of Genesis. So hang on with me. I'm a theologian and I'm not an economist. I'm a dabbler in economics. And you might wonder, what does Christian faith have to do with economics? Is Christianity not spiritual and therefore transcending or irrelevant to economic matters? So the kind of picture that one gets is this sort of thing. This is what Christianity is about. It's about the clouds and so on. Theology is about spiritual matters. Economics is about mundane, grounded sort of matters. And theology floats above the merely material. I think that's false. And in fact, it's Christianity that's more grounded in material reality than the dominant global economy, which is based on flight from the material world. So that's my thesis statement, and I'm going to try to convince you of that before we leave. A look at the Christian doctrine of creation should make this clear, and I'm going to argue that the global economy is not at all about materialism, but it's about the flight from the material world. So I'll begin by trying to explain and diagnose the current economic crisis, and I'm going to take as my starting point where the crisis began in 2008 in the housing market in the United States. And I'm going to show, I think, that the crisis is based in a fundamental inability to deal with reality. So much of what's gone wrong economically is precisely in the displacement of economic activity from the mundane and the material. And then I'm going to examine the Christian doctrine of creation to suggest what a properly grounded view of material reality can contribute to our understanding of economics. And finally end with some concrete suggestions for how communities can live this vision out. I should say as well that it's not an exclusively Christian view that I'm offering. It's a view based in scriptures and Christian theology, but it's a view that's shared with Judaism and I think to some extent Islam and other traditions as well. Okay, so first part, the current crisis. The sin of greed is certainly present in the current crisis, but a deeper explanation, I think, moves in the opposite direction. It's not driven by materialism, but by a desire to transcend the material world. There's a deep desire to transcend the limits of the material world, the limits of the human body and of death, to be free from scarcity and risk and dependence on a life that's materially based. So the buying and selling of things is important, but things are incompletely described as material because the economy is deeply imbued with fantasy. So I'm going to begin with a primer on how this all began. Part of it is very easy to understand. Banks lent money to people who couldn't pay the money back. Historically, low interest rates and aggressive lending practices in the 1990s and early 2000s led to a buying frenzy for houses. I'm going to talk about the American context because that's where it began. And so you have what's called the American dream, and the word dream, I think, adequately captures the sort of fantasy aspect of this. High-risk borrowers were being sold on loans with no down payment required, and they accepted the fanciful idea that homes would pay for themselves by rising in value. And so it's a great deal for all involved as long as the prices of houses continued to rise, and borrowers bought into the fantasy that they would always rise. But the rise in house prices was not based in any kind of extra financial reality. The rise was fueled by the loans themselves, right, which created the demand for houses, thus driving prices up. So the story begins then at one significant remove from reality. But it gets worse. Banks know that they're in higher risk territory here, so they come up with financial instruments which pass the risk on to someone else. Thus begins what is known as securitization, which is the packaging of consumer debt, mortgages especially, for sale as investments. These securities, called collateralized debt obligations, are marketed under the idea that in grouping mortgages together by the thousands, the good loans will outweigh the losses from the bad ones. And these are given AAA bond ratings, Moody's AAA ratings, and thus high-risk subprime mortgages are repackaged and sold as safe investments. So we've achieved one more level of remove from reality. The idea of a local banker kind of sitting down with someone and examining what they need and what they have and so on now seems quaint and anachronistic. But it gets worse than that. These collateralized debt obligations are listed by investment firms and hedge funds and banks as assets, and they're used as collateral for borrowing more money. Interest rates are so low they can borrow money cheaply and make investments at a much higher yield. So money is being borrowed by using debt as collateral. In traditional banking, right, there's Jimmy Stewart from It's a Wonderful Life. People deposit money in the bank, and the bank takes that money and loans it to other people, right? Although, of course, bank reserve requirements have never been 100%. But now banks and others were loaning out billions of dollars more than they actually had. And the relevant euphemism there is leveraging. But even loans of money you don't actually have are still rather mundane compared to some of the more exotic financial instruments that were marketed. With so much debt and insecurity, there must be a way to make money off the risk and the insecurity themselves. And thus were born credit default swaps, which were invented by J.P. Morgan in 1995. Now, here's how it works. Imagine that I loan Bob $100. I'm a little concerned about Bob's ability to pay me back, so I write a contract with Tracy in which Tracy promises to pay me back my $100 if Bob defaults. In exchange, I pay Tracy $10 a year. It's a credit default swap. It's a kind of insurance. So I'm insuring the loan that I made to Bob, in other words. The reason I need insurance on this loan, of course, is that I don't trust Bob. I'm willing to take risks on loaning money to unstable parties like Bob because I can pass the risk off to someone else. Credit default swaps, in other words, only encourage my risky behavior. Tracy, meanwhile, sees an opportunity to make money off the risk and my lack of trust. But, as you might now be ready to expect, it gets much worse than that. Mike also sees this opportunity to make money off risk and distrust, and he sees no reason why he should have to be a party to the original contract in order to profit from it. So he calls Kelly and says that in exchange for $10 a year, he will pay Kelly $100 if Bob defaults on my loan to him. This is usually done through futures, betting that a company's stock price will go up or down. Kelly is convinced that Bob will fail, so she takes Mike up on the deal. Bob, Tracy, and I don't even know that Mike and Kelly are in on the action. It's like taking out an insurance policy on someone else's life, right? Someone you don't even know. Or a better analogy, perhaps, is simply gambling, like going to a racetrack and putting $20 down on a horse. Except it's worse than that. Because unlike with most forms of gambling, there is no government regulation of these swaps, and so they're limited only by the extent of both parties' willingness to wager. In fact, the U.S. Congress passed a law in 2000 specifically prohibiting federal and state regulation of credit default swaps and other derivatives. The bill's sponsors were aware that these things looked an awful lot like gambling, and so they put a clause in the bill specifying, quote, that the bill would supersede and preempt the application of any state or local law that prohibits gaming. Anyway. Come visit us in the U.S. sometime. That's pretty interesting. If Bob defaults on my loan to him, I would get $100 from Tracy, but depending on how much money Kelly was willing to wager on Bob's failure, Kelly could collect millions or billions of dollars off my loan to Bob. The market in these swaps is enormous. No one knows exactly how enormous because they're not regulated, and they don't even need to be publicly disclosed. In fact, many parties don't even know who has the other side of the wager. Mike could sell his side of the bet to a third party without even telling Kelly. Estimates of the amount in outstanding credit default swaps vary, but in September of 2008, Fortune magazine estimated $54.6 trillion, which, as they pointed out, is greater than the world's total annual economic output. Not bad, considering they started from zero in 1995. Fortune explains their rapid rise this way. You can guess how Wall Street cowboys responded to the opportunity to make deals that, 1, can be struck in a minute, 2, require little or no cash up front, and 3, can cover anything. Yeehaw, you can almost picture Slim Pickens and Dr. Strangelove climbing onto the H-bomb before it's released from the B-52. That's a quote from Fortune magazine. Now, I gave a talk on this shortly after the crisis began, and someone who had worked on Wall Street came up and afterwards and said that my account of traders' motives was overly jaundiced, and she's probably right. The problem lies in the fact that fund managers are compensated based on short-term performance, and in a world of abstraction, where products are intangible and all value has been reduced to money, monetary compensation is the sole measure of a person's worth. So it's a world, in a world made of money, there's no other marker of identity or value than money. And so compensation is the only measure of value in which a world, in a world that's been financialized. And I think that's right. I mean, it's not just kind of greedy people that are motivated by this. But nevertheless, it seems that financial traders have turned the world into one gigantic casino, but it's really much worse than that. At a casino, you can be reasonably sure that if you win at blackjack, the casino will have enough cash on hand to pay you your winnings. No such reserve is legally required in the swaps market as it is in the real insurance market. The problem is that much more money is wagered than anyone actually has, right? More bets than the world's total economic annual output. So Tracy has guaranteed my loan to Bob, but Tracy has already spent the premiums or loaned them to someone else and has nothing to pay me with if Bob defaults. She was banking on her assets and collateralized debt obligations, but now they are plummeting in value as high-risk borrowers begin to default on their mortgages and home values drop. When Tracy goes bankrupt, I'm in trouble with the credit ratings agencies who see that I have a lot of unprotected loans outstanding. They lower my credit rating, making it harder for me to get access to real money. To make matters worse, I'm also up to my ears in the swaps market, insuring other people's debt. I go bankrupt and the whole system begins to unravel. When it does, it's often those who can least afford it that lose out, because the managers of relatively stodgy mutual funds who resisted buying these exotic securities at first eventually felt compelled to get into these riskier products when prices were higher, and the more nimble hedge funds who serve wealthier clients were already selling. So the mutual funds were oftentimes left holding the bag when the house of cards collapsed. But it's worse than actually collapsing. Since many bettors in the swaps market were betting on defaults, there's actually an incentive for many players to hasten the demise of companies by publicizing their problems and driving up the costs of insuring their debt by trading their credit default swaps contracts. On the other side, the government tried to stabilize the situation by bailing out the most reckless of players, stepping in to bail out a system it had deliberately refused to regulate. And where is the government getting the money? Well, they're borrowing it, of course. in enormous quantities. Okay, so much for the economic crisis. I want to talk a little bit about the theology involved here, the theology and spirituality of this kind of economy. I've given you just one example of how the economic crisis started in the U.S. In other countries, such as Europe right now, the stories are somewhat different. But at the root of all the crises is debt, the attempt to create value not from producing material goods, but from speculation. The economy has gotten detached from reality, in other words. There's too much leveraging going on, which is basically trying to build assets out of debt, which is to say, out of nothing at all. It's a creatio ex nihilo, to use the theological term, creation out of nothing that's built on perception. As in any pyramid scheme, it can be kept going only as long as the perception of growth is maintained, and when this bubble of perception is finally burst, the fall from unreality to reality can be very painful. Now, in order to see how theology can help in such a situation, I'm a theologian, so theology is always much more useful than people think it is. It's important to grasp the prevailing economic paradigm as a kind of theology, a kind of spirituality. The aspiration of such an economy is not simply to make money. The aspiration, more deeply, I think, is to leave behind physical constraints and limits that are created by being a mortal creature in space and time. It's an attempt to transcend that, to cheat death. And I'm going to look at three different kinds of limits that the paradigm seeks to overcome: scarcity, risk, and the need for trust. Scarcity is said to be the central problematic for the discipline of economics. You learn this in Economics 101. It's based on the idea of unlimited desires facing limited resources. But the financialization of the economy, as it's been called, can be seen as an attempt to overcome the limits of the material world by making wealth multiply without any increase in real material production. Economists have worried since the end in the 1970s of the post-war capitalist boom that growth and profitability have stagnated because of overproduction, the high price of oil, the physical limits on growth that ecological reality has imposed. Financialization is seen as an escape route, as Walden Bellow puts it, an attempt to make money out of nothing when the real material economy runs up against its limit. Much of the growth in economy has been in the financial sector, but it's not real growth in the material sense. It creates profit for some, but not necessarily true new value. Profit depends on getting in early on speculative bubbles that eventually burst because they're based on perception. We've been sold on the imperative of economic growth at all costs, and such faith in growth is not just a material, I think, but it's a spiritual aspiration, an attempt to get beyond our damnable servitude to material reality, and so to overcome human vulnerability and human limits. So, secondly, risk. At first glance, one might mistakenly think that this type of economy embraces risk and vulnerability. And there is certainly a certain kind of recklessness to it. But in fact, if we've seen, the crisis was built on the attempt to defer risk or pass it along to someone else. This is securitization. There was no attempt, as in some forms of lending, to enter into a relationship of shared risk between lender and borrower. The whole point was short-term profit and quick passing off of loans to others before the true risks became apparent. So the system is based on the fantasy that people can be free of vulnerability, that profit can be made risk-free. Governments help to perpetuate this fantasy. Government's role in the process is to absorb risk, to bail out the most reckless with borrowed money, which is only to defer the consequences and the risk to some later time. What we seem to want from our elected officials, in other words, is to permit us to continue avoiding reality for as long as possible, to live on value borrowed from the future. And to live on value borrowed from the future is most fundamentally, I think, an attempt to cheat death. Thirdly, then, trust. As we've seen, the economic crisis was built not simply on a failure of trust, but more fundamentally on the attempt to overcome the necessity of trust. The reason that loans needed to be insured is that they were made between parties who lacked a basic sense of trust in one another. Any idea that loans depend on some kind of relationship and trust over time is done away with in this model. Money can be made much more quickly if the necessity of trust is done away with. And more than this, profit can be made from distrust itself by offering to guarantee loans between mutually suspicious parties. Even more than this, money can be made in the swaps market from other people's failures, as we've already seen. So not only is it unnecessary to trust in another's ability to succeed, but one can actively root for and even abet the other's failure and profit from it. From a spiritual point of view, what we see in this is an aspiration to freedom, understood negatively as freedom from obligation to others. The kind of relationships of dependence that limit human freedom, the necessity of community, reliance upon others, the stasis of an economy restricted to local face-to-face encounters. These are seen as outmoded remnants of the economies of traditional societies and have no place in a contemporary economy. So I've concentrated on the current crisis of financialization, but these Gnostic tendencies, I think, have been aspirations of the prevailing economic system for much of the 20th century. Consumerism, for example, which I'm going to talk about tomorrow, is famously prone to fantasy and flight from the attachments of human relationships. Okay, so now we're going to do some theology proper. What does the Christian doctrine of creation have to say about these aspirations? I'm going to talk about the groundedness of the account of creation that you find in the book of Genesis. There's two basic features of the Genesis account of creation. First, material reality is good. Secondly, material reality is limited, right? It's good. God saw that it was good. God saw that it was good. God saw that it was good. And yet creation is not God, right? Creation is something else. So both of these truths, that it's good and it's limited, issue logically from the fact of creation. Creation has some share in the goodness of God by virtue of the fact that it relies upon the being of God for its being. If God is good, then the creation of God must also be good. And yet precisely because it's created, it's not creator. Creator and creation are not on a continuum of being. They're entirely different as cause and caused. God is not a thing in the universe. This is what I think Richard Dawkins doesn't understand. That God is not a big guy in the sky, right? That God is not a thing at all. God is not a part of the universe. Creation then is limited by virtue of being created. The Christian doctrine of creation approaches material reality then with realism and humility, ideally anyway, a recognition of the limited and dependent nature of creation. At the same time, however, because it also recognizes that creation is good, there is no need to try to transcend reality and escape our creatureliness. To be a creature of a good God is a condition to rejoice in and not rebel against. Oops, how did that get in there? I forgot I put that in there. Yeah. Oh, dear. I think I just forgot to put that in. Oh, well. Back to more serious theological matters here. So, again, two basic truths that follow from the fact of creation. So, finitude is not a condition from which we need... What is the next one? Yeah, okay. All right. Finitude is not a condition from which we need to be saved because creation is not a falling away from God. The creation of something besides God is the beginning of a great, if tempestuous, love story, an erotic attraction of creator and creature. Creation is not this one-time event, but a continuous and intimate sustaining of the creature in being. Thomas Aquinas stresses the absolute ontological divide between creator and creature, ontological meaning in being. Right? God is not a thing in the universe, but is the sheer act of existence itself, says Aquinas. And yet precisely then, because creature and creator don't compete for space on the same, it's not a zero-sum game. They're not on the same level at all. The creator and the creature share the deepest intimacy because God must constantly cause being in each creature, and because being is innermost in each thing, Aquinas reasons that God is in all things and innermostly, as he says. Creation produces both the greatest divide and the greatest intimacy between creator and creatures. And creatures means not just human beings, but every material thing that has being. So Christians then are often puzzled or bored by the passages in the Torah that are concerned with regulating every aspect of Israelite life, right? Does the Holy Book really need to tell us what to do when one ox gores another, right? You know, why are bald eagles detestable to eat, but bald locusts are okie dokie, right? And so on, right? Is this really spirituality, and so on? The details of such passages might need some sorting out, but the overall point should not be missed. The Hebrew Scripture writers had an abiding concern with the materiality of life. There simply was no distinction to be made between spiritual concerns and material concerns. I have a Jewish theologian friend who says that any religion that doesn't tell you what to do with your genitals and pots and pans is not worth believing in. And I think that's exactly right. So in other words, the realm of the material is not just this kind of inert and indifferent means to spiritual aspirations. The salvation of the whole community is worked out not in some interior dialogue with God, but in everyday interactions with the material world. So the law codes of the Hebrew Scriptures, unfortunately, which was one of the most neglected parts of the Bible for Christians, are meant to habituate a deep awareness of and rootedness in one's particular physical surroundings. The land, the trees, the birds, and the animals are all meant to fit within the harmonious order willed by God. Work, eating, worship, sex, what to do with one's waste, what to do with birds' nests, etc., are all linked together in such a way that the life of the community with God is meant to fit into the actual physical landscape that the people inhabit. There is no divide between spiritual and economic matters, and the biblical writers would have found any such divide to be perverse or unthinkable. They recognize there's a spirituality embedded in all kinds of economic practice, whether we acknowledge it or not, right? So the overall title of this series of lectures that I've been giving is The Migrations of the Holy, the idea that there isn't a sort of realm that is devoid of the holy. It's just kind of migrated into different areas. And economics, I think, is one of those places that it's migrated to, even though we oftentimes refuse to acknowledge it. For Christians, the erotic unity of God and material creation is affirmed in the incarnation of Jesus Christ. As Karl Barth argues, we don't begin with the reality of the physical world and then deduce that there must have been a creator. There isn't anything given about the material world. Some traditions stress the unreality of the material and the need to escape it. But Barth says that we only know the reality of the material world through Jesus Christ, whose reality affirms that God does not want to exist alone. As Barth says, because God has become man, the existence of creation can no longer be doubted. So here Barth is following a path blazed by Irenaeus and his controversies with the Gnostics. The Gnostics believed that material creation was evil, and that the Old Testament was the testament of an evil material God who created matter, and the aspiration then is to be free, to be liberated from matter. Irenaeus then argues against them that there is no dualism between the supreme God and the God of Jesus Christ, who is responsible for some kind of invisible spiritual universe. Irenaeus affirmed the doctrine of creation, of the incarnation, and affirmed the unity, therefore, between the God of creation and the God of Jesus Christ, against the docetic tendencies of the Gnostics. Docetism is the idea that Jesus only appeared to have a human body, but was really just kind of wearing it like a costume. Versions of which you can find arguably in certain kinds of Muslim belief as well, specifically about Jesus. Irenaeus argues that the Word was made flesh, which had been derived from the earth, which he had recapitulated in himself, bearing salvation to his own handiwork. Okay. I don't know what's going on with my PowerPoint here, but it's all messed up. All right. I'll get there eventually. Irenaeus then links creation and salvation, affirming at once the goodness of creation, which came through Jesus Christ the Word, and the final consummation of that creation in the union of the one God and the material creation in the incarnation. So Irenaeus finds harmony between what Ellen Davis calls the materialism of the Hebrew Scriptures and the central conviction of the New Testament that Jesus Christ is the Word of God made flesh. If the Christian tradition from its Jewish roots to its consummation in Jesus Christ is materialistic, however, it's a very different kind of materialism than that which modernity is sometimes labeled, right? Biblical materialism does not insist that the material as we know it is all there is, but rather that we are limited by our being mortal, material creatures in space and time, and we must therefore approach material reality with an attitude of humility. Modern scientific materialism, on the other hand, is the dangerous illusion that all is reducible to the merely material, and that science can eventually overcome any limits that the merely material might put in our way. Davis calls this kind of thinking magical, and I think she's right about that. For despite its ostensible grounding in science, this form of materialism is strangely oblivious to what may be the most readily observable and non-negotiable characteristic of our material world, namely finitude. So we come then to the second important characteristic of the doctrine of creation. Material reality, although it's good, is limited. It's clear from the first creation account in Genesis that all that is dependent, or all that is dependent upon God for its existence. Humans are situated within this ordering of creation, not above it, although being made in God's image does confer a unique status on humans. Humans are made in God's image, but they're not God's image. The image of God is not a quality, furthermore, which is inherent in human nature. It can be damaged or obscured. It's a relational concept and not something which is intrinsic to human nature, in a sense. And as Dietrich Bonhoeffer and others have noted, the earth in Genesis 1 is a major actor, second only to God. Now, some people concentrate on God's gift of dominion to the humans, dominion over creation, and say this is the origins of the attempt to exploit and so on. And it has been taken, there's no question that it has been taken that way by many Christians over time. But ownership of the land belongs to God and it is never to be appropriated for private use. Leviticus, for example, the land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine, it's not yours. With me you are but aliens and tenants. The implication that humans transcend the land is also contradicted by the creation of humans in Genesis 2 from the dust of the ground. Humans are part of the earth and don't stand apart from it. Humans as in humus and humility, words for humus as in the ground, right? And the same sort of play on words goes on in Hebrew as well. Davis shows how the verbs in Genesis 2:15, commonly translated to till and to keep the garden, can be translated to serve and to observe. Humans are to protect and preserve the land as well as learn from it, for our knowledge is finite and must be attuned to our actual material surroundings. As Davis comments, Adam comes to Eden as a protector, answerable for the well-being of the precious thing that he did not make. He is to be an observer, mindful of limits that are built into the created order as both inescapable and fitting. The biblical writer does not subscribe to the fantasy that our society has embraced as an ideal, that human ingenuity runs up against physical limits only in order to overcome them. The finite nature of the earth is not just a result of the fall when Adam is told that the ground is cursed because of him. Indeed, it may be the case that the curse is simply a consequence of Adam's attempt to ignore or defy the limits imposed by material reality. The ground is cursed only insofar as Adam refuses to accept his own finite existence, right? The primordial sin that Genesis identifies is eat of this and you will be like God, right? The primordial sin is trying to transcend and trying to be godlike in that word. So the fall is not the fall of humanity into finiteness. The fall is precisely the attempt to refuse finiteness, to transcend finiteness. At the root of all sin is the attempt to avoid reality, as Thomas Merton once said. Isn't that a great quote? The root of all sin is the attempt to avoid reality. And the story of the Tower of Babel kind of completes this account of the fall, right? The attempt to build a stairway to heaven. What's most pertinent about this story for our purposes is the way that scattering is a consequence of humans' attempts to make a name for themselves. Scattering is a result of the human refusal to acknowledge dependence on God or dependence on anyone else. And so the salvation of the Israelites then begins in the next chapter, Genesis 12, in their belonging to the chosen people, to being gathered together again. And the gathering of Pentecost is the reversal of the scattering of Babel. It's, of course, the Christian hope and assurance that death will not have the final word and a share in eternal life will be ours. But salvation in Christ is not simply the overcoming of the limits of human existence, especially death. Christ's triumph is a triumph through the cross, an invitation to new life that begins by death to the self. The grain of wheat must fall into the ground and die to have eternal life, as it says in the Gospel of John. And to be saved by Christ is to be joined to the suffering body of Christ. We don't overcome death, or we do overcome death, but only insofar as the limits of the small self are overcome in dependence on God and on one another. So the limits of the self are overcome by accepting membership in a body where, as Paul says, weakness is clothed with honor and all suffer and rejoice together. As Thomas Merton writes, I live to Christ when I die to myself. I begin to live to Christ when I come to the end or to the limit of what divides me from my fellow human being. So to speak positively of limits, of scarcity and mutual dependence and shared risk and trust is not to resign oneself to a tragic creation, right? That we have a stingy God. Jesus says, I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. But Jesus talks about abundant life in the context of the sheepfold of which he's the shepherd. To live abundantly is not to cut oneself off from relationship with the sheep and the shepherd and the land, or to indulge in fantasies of freedom from the care of others and limitless material satisfaction without consequences. Abundant life is accepting the shepherd's love and living in nurturing relationship with all of creation. And in this sense, then, scarcity has to mean something different than it does for economists. In economics, scarcity results from the assumption that human desires for finite goods are unlimited. The problem with this assumption is not the idea that goods are finite, but that human desires for such goods are infinite. That's to write greed into the very nature of the human person, right? The assumption of scarcity is the assumption that human desire must be infinite in this way. And so, therefore, all of economic activity is cast in a tragic mode. There's only a certain amount of stuff, right? And you want it, and I want it, and we can't all have it, and so we need to compete for it. Scarcity is a valid assumption, provided it's based on the recognition of the finite nature of goods, not on the insatiability of human desire for finite goods. Our task is to cultivate a finite desire for finite goods and an infinite desire for the only infinite good. So finally, in conclusion then, being grounded, what does this mean in practice? If we're to practice an economy that embraces both the goodness and the limits of creation, then we have to be grounded. If we see ourselves as made from God's breath and the dust of the ground, then we'll see ourselves and the material creation as invested with cosmic significance. Our work will be more than an instrumental relationship with the material, more than a means to give flight to our spirits away from this tragically limited, dependent mortal life. It will be a way of blessing the creation of God, of which God has made us part. Many responses to the current economic crisis have advocated a greater role for the state in regulating markets, and I acknowledge that state intervention can prevent some of the worst types of abuses and is important in many respects. However, I want to register a note of caution against putting too much faith in the state to save us, primarily because, as I mentioned briefly last night, I just don't think that the state and the corporation are really two different things anymore. The state and the corporation have become too closely intertwined to expect the state to rein in the corporation. It can, and sometimes does. But the state has oftentimes taken on the role of enabler. The state is there to pick up the pieces when reckless market behavior leads to disastrous consequences. People don't look so much to the state to defend them against corporate power and financial predation. They look to the state to defer the consequences of a sick economy to some future time. As Wendell Berry has written, we should not expect someone else, state or corporation, to solve the problem, because the problem begins with the fact that we have already given proxies for almost all of our economic and political practices to them. We have given proxies to corporations to produce all our food, clothing, shelter. We're rapidly giving proxies to corporations and the state to provide education, health care, child care, all sorts of services that local communities used to provide. As Berry says, quote, our major economic practice, in short, is to delegate the practice to others, end quote. Solutions can sometimes come from governments and corporations, but people, I think, need to heal economic practices by bringing them back down to earth, giving local communities a direct involvement in discerning what's necessary for the health of the community. This means acknowledging dependence on one another and sharing risk. It means being attentive to local forms of knowledge of people and land. It means reestablishing direct face-to-face relationships between producers and consumers, as well as encouraging everyone to become producers. Gardening, baking bread, making furniture, brewing beer, whatever it might be, to reconnect with the material world and not simply be passive consumers. It's hard to overstate the difference between the way most people throughout most of history in most of the world have lived. In most of history, most people throughout the world, the things that they had were things that they made, and for us, the things that we have are things that we bought. And this is a fundamentally different way of relating to the material world that I don't think is devoid of spiritual consequences. We need, furthermore, to stop giving our money over to an abstract and destructive financial system and put it to work locally through credit unions and co-ops that can make realistic and cooperative assessments of debt and risk. Churches, finally, are taking roles in fostering these kinds of grounded economies, supporting the kinds of local development projects, fair trade arrangements, credit unions, community-supported agriculture products, and so on. I discuss a lot of these in my book, Being Consumed. Economy is not a separate sphere of life, finally. I want to emphasize that. Economy, we need to stop thinking of economy as a separate sphere of life that only intersects with the religious or spiritual sphere when people act immorally with their money or are unable to meet their needs. The idea that theology and economics are two separate pursuits is a thoroughly modern idea, the product of the last 250 years ago, an idea that Christians traditionally and a lot of other people would have found bizarre. If we can again see how doctrines of creation and incarnation are inseparable from our economic practices, we can help to heal the material world. Thank you.